In September 1944, General George Patton's Third Army was doing something the German High Command considered impossible. They were moving faster than any army in history had ever moved. 500 kilometers in 1 week, outrunning their own supply lines, stretching across 180 kilometers of front. The German military leadership looked at the situation and calculated odds. They had 58 brand new Panther tanks, the deadliest tank on the Western Front, fresh from the factories. Not a single battle scar among them. They had concentrated them into the 113th Panzer Brigade under General Hasso von Manteuffel. The math was simple: 58 superior German tanks against scattered American forces. This should have ended the American advance. It should have created a crisis that forced Patton to stop, consolidate, and retreat. 58 Panthers went into the battle at Arracourt. Only 8 came back. What happened in those 12 days wasn't a failure of German courage. It wasn't a failure of German engineering. It was a collision between two completely different ways of war. And it would reveal something the German military couldn't comprehend. Sometimes the machine that works best isn't the machine with the thickest armor. This is how Patton defeated the Germans, not with a better tank, but with something far more valuable. To understand why the Germans sent 58 Panthers to stop Patton, you have to understand what Patton had done in August 1944 that had the entire German general staff in a state of panic. D-Day was June 6, 1944. The Allies invaded Normandy with over 1 million men. The initial beachhead was small and precarious. The American forces were pinned down in the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy, fighting house to house, field to field. Progress was measured in kilometers per month, not kilometers per week. For 6 weeks, the Allies were bogged down. The German strategy was perfect for this terrain. Fixed defensive positions, machine guns in hedgerows, counterattacks against exposed American armor. It was a grinding, bloody, slow advance. But on August 1, 1944, General George S. Savmist, Patton took command of the American Third Army. The Normandy breakout had just begun. The German 7th Army was collapsing. The door was open. Patton did something that conventional military logic said was suicide. He didn't consolidate. He didn't set up supply depots and staging areas. He didn't wait for reinforcements. He kept moving. Third Army advanced 480 kilometers in the first month. They didn't attack in neat formations. They scattered across the countryside, bypassing strongpoints, moving forward in columns, never stopping. The German military command was horrified. From Berlin to Field Marshal Rundstedt's headquarters, they watched Patton's forces racing across France, and they saw the opportunity. Patton was overextended. His supply lines were stretched back 400 kilometers. His forces were scattered across 180 kilometers of front. He was vulnerable. General Hasso von Manteuffel was called to Berlin. He was one of Germany's most talented generals. Aggressive, intelligent, bold. The German High Command gave him an assignment: take your Panzer Brigade and smash Patton's right flank. Create a crisis, force the Americans to stop. Manteuffel was given 58 brand new Panther tanks from the factory, not veteran tanks with experienced crews, fresh tanks with fresh crews. Most of the tank commanders had only 2 weeks of training. Some couldn't even read maps properly. But the tanks themselves were magnificent. The Panther was officially classified as a medium tank, but it weighed nearly 45 metric tons heavier than most nations' heavy tanks. It had sloped armor that was almost impossible to penetrate. A 75mm high-velocity cannon that could kill a Sherman from 2,000 meters away. The American Sherman had a stubby 75mm gun that couldn't penetrate a Panther's front armor even at point-blank range. On paper, the disparity was enormous. The Panther's gun could kill a Sherman from distances where the Sherman's gun was useless. The Panther's armor could bounce American shells like they were pebbles. Manteuffel understood this advantage. He did the math coldly, like a man calculating odds on a bet. The 113th Panzer Brigade had been allocated 600,000 liters of fuel, enough for 2 days of intensive operations. 2 days was all he needed. Strike fast, concentrate force, punch through the American right flank, disrupt the entire operation. By all conventional military logic, it should have worked. But Manteuffel was making a calculation based on how wars had been fought in 1940. He didn't know what would happen in 1944. While Manteuffel was concentrating his 58 tanks, something else was happening thousands of kilometers away in America. American factories were producing tanks at a rate that would have seemed impossible to any German officer. Not just tanks, everything. Trucks, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, radios. In 1944, American factories produced 17,641 tanks. Germany produced 3,395. But here's the thing that separated American from German war production. It wasn't just the number. It was what the Americans could do with those numbers. The American logistics system was a conveyor belt from the factories to the front. The Red Ball Express, a continuous circuit of trucks running day and night, moved supplies forward. It was complicated, it was strained, but it worked. And the American army could replace losses at a rate the Germans couldn't comprehend. When a Sherman was destroyed, it was replaced within days. When a tank crew was lost, new crews arrived within weeks. Training was continuous. Replacement parts were abundant. Patton understood this. He understood that he wasn't winning battles just because his tactics were good. He was winning because he had access to something the Germans didn't: unlimited replacement. But at Arracourt, Patton's key advantage wasn't his supply line. It was 3 things that no German officer could have predicted. The first was information. American intelligence was watching the German buildup. They had observation posts. They had radio intercepts. They didn't know exactly where the attack would come, but they knew it was coming. The second was terrain. The terrain around Arracourt was rolling hills with scattered forests and villages. It was tank country, but it was defensive tank country. The Americans knew the ground. They could prepare positions. They could choose where to fight. The third thing was organizational doctrine. And this is where the American way of war revealed itself to be fundamentally different from the German way. When an American unit took position, they didn't just put tanks in a line. They used combined arms tactics. Infantry supported tanks. Tank destroyers were positioned to cover flanks. Artillery was coordinated and ready. Radios worked. Communication was clear. Colonel Bruce C. Clark commanded Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division. Under him were the 37th Tank Battalion, armored infantry, artillery, and tank destroyers. It was a combined arms team. Not just tanks, a complete integrated fighting unit. Clark understood his role. He wasn't trying to win the battle with armor alone. He was using armor as part of a larger system. His tanks would be the hammer. His infantry would hold ground. His artillery would soften German attacks. His tank destroyers would be on standby for German armor. When the Germans attacked, Clark was ready. September 18, 1944 dawned thick with fog. Visibility was measured in tens of meters. The fog was a gift to the Germans. They couldn't be seen from the air. No American P-47 fighters would be able to attack them. The Panther's superior long-range gun would be nearly useless. The Germans attacked before dawn, Panthers moving out of the mist, 58 of them spread across multiple routes trying to find the American positions. Some groups were moving on roads. Some were moving cross-country. It was chaos, exactly the kind of chaotic attack that could overwhelm an unprepared opponent. The first Panthers hit the American positions near Bezung at dawn. They appeared through the fog and immediately contacted American forces, M4 Shermans, outnumbered, outgunned. An American observation post spotted the Germans coming. The M4 crews were already in position, already waiting. The Shermans didn't try to fight the Panthers head-on. That would have been suicide. Instead, they waited. The Panthers advanced at less than 75 meters range. The observation post radioed back to the M4 crews. The M4s waited until the Germans were committed, until the Panthers thought they had the advantage, until the Shermans could use something the Germans didn't have: speed and maneuverability. The Shermans opened fire. 2 Panthers died immediately. The German gunners were too slow. The Shermans rotated their turrets faster than the Panthers could traverse. This was the first lesson the Germans learned that day. The Panther had a more powerful gun, but the Sherman had a faster turret traverse. In close combat, this mattered more than armor. The Panthers retreated into the mist, but they kept coming. Sergeant Dunn saw the firefight from his position. He was in a Sherman east of Lizay. He ordered his gunner to swing south toward the Germans. At 600 meters, Dunn opened fire on a Panther attempting to escape. The shell hit clean. The Panther exploded. By 9 a.m. on September 18th, the Germans had lost 5 Panthers in the opening hours, 5 tanks destroyed by Shermans that, on paper, had no business winning such a fight. But the Germans kept pushing. General Manteuffel had allocated 600,000 liters of fuel. He intended to use all of it. He sent more Panthers forward, different routes, different approaches. This time the Americans were ready. Colonel Clark had organized a trap. His tanks and tank destroyers were positioned to hit the Germans on the flanks. His infantry held the villages. When the Germans attacked, they were immediately under fire from multiple directions. Company B, under Captain William Lamison, had set up a hasty ambush. They were outnumbered 3-1. Panthers were bearing down on them with superior firepower. But Lamison had prepared his position carefully. He had hedgerows for cover. He had elevation. He had time to prepare. When the first group of Panthers appeared, Lamison's gunners waited for the best shot. The range closed to 400 meters, then 300, then 200. At 150 meters, Lamison opened fire. His 75mm cannon struck the lead Panther. It brewed up. The crews bailed out, running. The other Panthers wheeled to face the threat, but their turrets moved slowly. The Shermans were already firing. One Panther after another erupted in flames. Lamison's quick estimates were that his crew had destroyed 5 Panthers before the remaining Germans broke off. When the smoke cleared, 8 Panthers were burning around his position. 8 tanks, destroyed by 4 Shermans. The Germans had sent 58 Panthers to break the American lines. Within 12 hours, they had lost nearly 30. The attack should have already been failing, but Manteuffel kept pushing. The next day, September 19th, the Germans launched more attacks. Different units, different routes. Panthers kept appearing through the fog, and each time the Americans were ready. The pattern was always the same. Germans attack with superior armor. Americans wait. Germans close range. Americans exploit the Panthers' slow turret traverse. Germans die. But here's where the American advantage became truly overwhelming. Major Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter was flying in his Piper L4 Cub observation aircraft. It was a tiny plane, fabric-covered wings, plywood fuselage. He had mounted bazookas to the wings. Bazookas infantry anti-tank weapons mounted on a plane. When the fog finally lifted around noon, Carpenter had a clear view of the German armor. He dived on the German column. His observer fired bazookas. Rockets raced down toward the Panthers. Carpenter was flying straight into German ground fire. The anti-aircraft guns followed him. Bullets snapped through his wings. He kept diving. He fired all his rockets, hit several Panthers, then he flew back to base, reloaded, and came back for another run. 2 more sorties that afternoon. 16 bazookas fired at German armor. Carpenter was credited with destroying 2 Panthers himself and damaging several others. To the German tankers, a small fabric plane with bazookas probably seemed insane, suicide, impossible, but it worked. It represented something the German military couldn't process. In 1944, American combined arms meant everything. Tanks alone were insufficient. You needed infantry support. You needed artillery. You needed air support. You needed coordination across all branches of the military. Germany had designed perfect tanks. America had designed a perfect system. By September 20th, something remarkable was happening on the German side. The 111th Panzer Brigade, supposed to support the 113th Brigade's attack, arrived late to the battle. Why? Because they ran out of fuel on the way. Think about that for a moment. Germany had designed the most sophisticated tank in history, precision optics superior to anything the Americans had, interleaved road wheels for superior suspension, sloped armor superior to any other tank design, a high-velocity cannon that was generations ahead of American guns. But they couldn't produce enough fuel to move 58 of these machines 20 kilometers. Germany's fuel production was collapsing. The Allies had bombed the refineries. Oil shipments from Romania had been cut off. Germany was rationing fuel for everything. The Panther consumed 400 liters of fuel to move 100 kilometers. 58 Panthers required 2,320 liters of fuel just to move 100 kilometers. With 600,000 liters allocated for 2 days of intensive operations, Manteuffel was watching his fuel reserves deplete by the hour. He had to win quickly, or his attack would simply stop. Meanwhile, General Patton was in a completely different situation. Yes, his fuel lines were stretched. Yes, he was complaining about shortages. But when a Sherman was destroyed, he could request replacements, and those replacements came. Within 3 days of the Battle of Arracourt starting, new Shermans arrived at the front. American factories couldn't be bombed away, American shipping couldn't be disrupted, American supply lines couldn't be cut. It was the difference between a system that was barely maintaining itself and a system that was continuously growing stronger. Colonel Clark's combat command lost 25 tanks in the first crucial days of fighting. Within 3 days, his combat strength was restored to full. Within a week, his operational strength was arguably higher than when the battle started. Manteuffel lost 50 Panthers. He got 0 replacements. By September 20th, the German 113th Panzer Brigade had lost 50 Panthers out of 58. They still had 8 operational. 8. Manteuffel made a decision. He couldn't win with what he had. The attack was exhausted. The fuel was nearly gone. The Panthers were burning out on the roads. He ordered the 113th to fall back. The battle was over. Total German losses: out of 262 tanks and assault guns deployed across the entire operation, 86 were destroyed, 114 were damaged or broken down. Only 62 were operational by the end of the month. The 113th Panzer Brigade had entered with 58 Panthers. They withdrew with 8. American losses: 41 M4 medium tanks and 7 M5 light tanks during the entire month of September. Casualties were 225 killed and 648 wounded. But critically, American losses were replaceable. German losses were not. The mathematics of the battle were simple. The Panther was superior to the Sherman in almost every technical measure: armor, firepower, reliability. On paper, the Germans should have won. But Patton wasn't fighting on paper. He was fighting in a system, a supply system, a communications system, a combined arms system, a system where inferior tanks, guided by superior organization and unlimited replacement capacity, could defeat technically superior tanks driven by trained but inexperienced crews led by a general who had allocated himself only 2 days of fuel. Here's what makes the Battle of Arracourt truly meaningful. The Germans weren't defeated because they made stupid decisions. Well, they made some stupid decisions, but that's not what lost them the battle. They were defeated because they built a system that could only work if everything went perfectly. A system that had no redundancy, no cushion, no tolerance for error. The Panther was rushed into service in 1943 at the Battle of Kursk with unresolved technical problems. It broke down constantly. The final drive units had an average lifespan of only 150 kilometers. The whole tank was a masterpiece of engineering that was almost impossible to manufacture, almost impossible to service, almost impossible to keep running. Compare that to the Sherman. The Sherman was simple, reliable, easy to manufacture, easy to service. Crews could be trained quickly. Mechanics could fix them in the field. Replacement parts were abundant. By 1944, the Panther had been refined. Most of the bugs were fixed, but it was still a machine that required perfect conditions to function. It was still a machine that consumed enormous amounts of fuel. It was still a machine designed for a Germany that had secure supply lines and unlimited resources. That Germany no longer existed. Patton's Third Army was drawing power from factories in Michigan, New Jersey, Ohio, from ore mines in Pennsylvania, from oil refineries in Texas. When a Sherman was destroyed, it was replaced by another Sherman rolling off the assembly line. The Germans had no such luxury. When a Panther was destroyed, it was gone, forever. This is the thing that historians often overlook about World War II. Germany lost not because it made worse decisions, though they often did. Germany lost because America had built a system that could absorb losses and continue fighting. Germany built a system that required perfection. In a war where nothing goes perfectly, the system that requires perfection eventually fails. The soldiers of the 4th Armored Division at Arracourt weren't superhuman. They weren't tactical geniuses. They were American tankers with average training, average equipment, and average courage. But they had something the Germans didn't. They knew that if they lost, they would be replaced. They knew that their supply lines were secure. They knew that their commanders wouldn't ration them fuel for a 2-day operation and hope for the best. This knowledge changed everything. Patton understood this. He understood that he wasn't winning battles with clever tactics alone. He was winning because he had access to more tanks, more fuel, more ammunition, more of everything than his enemy could produce. He once said, "No bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making some other poor bastard die for his country." What Patton meant was, you don't win wars by sacrifice. You win wars by ensuring you have more tanks than your enemy, more fuel, more ammunition, more of everything that matters. The Battle of Arracourt proved this principle perfectly. When the smoke cleared, the landscape was littered with burning Panthers. 50 tanks that German factories had painstakingly built. 50 tanks that represented thousands of hours of work, carefully allocated resources, precision engineering. All destroyed, damaged, or abandoned because the system that produced them could not sustain them in continuous operation. The Panther was arguably the finest tank produced in World War II. Certainly the most refined, but it was refined to the point of fragility. It required perfect conditions, perfect maintenance, perfect fuel supply, perfect training. In 1944, Germany couldn't provide any of these things. The Sherman, by contrast, was built for imperfection, built for shortcuts, built for mechanics who weren't highly trained, built for service in conditions that weren't perfect. And because it was built for the real world, it survived in the real world. The Battle of Arracourt didn't change the course of the war. Patton's advance continued. The Third Army pushed deeper into France and Germany. By the spring of 1945, it was all over. But what Arracourt proved was something fundamental about war that still applies today. Technical superiority matters, but it is not sufficient. A better gun doesn't win if you can't replace the gun. Better armor doesn't win if you can't replace the armor. Superior doctrine doesn't win if you don't have the logistics to support it. The Germans built machines that were superior to American machines, but America built a system that was superior to the German system. And in war, the system always wins in the end. 58 Panthers went into the battle at Arracourt. Only 8 came back, not because the Panther was a bad tank, But because Germany didn't have the resources to fight a war against a nation that could replace 50 tanks in a week, Patton understood this. That's why he kept moving. Not because he was a brilliant tactician, though he was, but because he knew that every day his army kept moving was a day that German resources were being depleted and American resources were being replenished. He understood that in a contest between a superior machine and a superior system, the system always wins.